Welcome to the Past Life Awakening Institute podcast. I'm Mark Beal, a past life regression therapist and trainer. Each episode shines a light on healers like hypnosis and hypnotherapy, past lives, between lives, and spirit releasement therapy. If you're interested in having personal sessions or certification training in any of these modalities, go to my pastlifeawakeninginstitute.com website for details. Today my guest is Simon Bown, past life regression therapist and host of the Past Lives podcast. Simon's got a fantastic podcast investigating evidence demonstrating the survival of the human soul, looking at past life memories and near-death experiences, which I really recommend listening to. He has a lot of experts in the area and is a fascinating interviewer. Welcome to the podcast, Simon. Thanks very much for being here.
Well, thanks for asking me to come on. It's very interesting. I'm usually the host asking the questions, so this time I'm the victim. Should be interesting.
Exactly. The roles are reversed. I think a lot of your listeners will enjoy this. So Simon, can you tell us a little bit about that podcast?
My website is called pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. And that's a kind of dual website where part of it's dedicated to the podcast and part of it's dedicated to the past life regression therapy. So far, I've done 170 episodes. Each one's an hour-long interview. And I try and go in depth with the guests. I've interviewed Dr. Raymond Moody, Dr. Eben Alexander. There's Leslie Kane, she wrote the book Surviving Death that the Netflix series is based on. Dr. Christopher Kerr. I mean, there's so many people. And, Eben Alexander was professor of neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School, and he had a near-death experience. So he's a great guest because he not only had the near-death experience, but he's got all that knowledge on how the brain works. And I interviewed the guy who's professor of neuroscience at New York University. So there's that side of the podcast. But on the other side, I've interviewed people who've had near-death experiences and people who remember their past lives, like Jenny Cockle, who remembers all her past lives. She's never done it with hypnosis. And she said when she was a child, she thought it was weird that everybody didn't remember all their past lives. And I talk about deathbed visions, mediumship, shared death experiences. There's a whole ton of stuff there about the afterlife. So hopefully people find it really interesting. I certainly love doing the interviews.
I really recommend that. And you go in depth, like, as you say, near-death experiences, ETs as well, and people with encounters with that. And you've got some personal experiences with that and your own past lives that you've recalled. A lot of people do know you as a podcaster, but I thought we could start and focus on really Simon, the therapist, the past life therapist, the hypnotherapist. So can you tell us a little bit, in that other hat that you wear, what are the main modalities that you do use?
I was trained as a clinical hypnotherapist. And so I learned all sorts of techniques working with stopping smoking and weight loss and, maybe fear of flying. And the thing was, I was always only really interested in past life regression and between lives. And so I've kind of filtered out everything else. And all I do now is the past life regression therapy. And occasionally people contact me for just out of interest. They just want to see what happens. And so I'm happy to do a single session with people if they want to just kind of do an exploration. Because when I was younger and I did my first past life regression in the 80s, that's all I wanted. It wasn't for therapy. I just wanted to see what would happen.
So you started off studying hypnotherapy. So how did you find the connection from hypnotherapy then leading into past life regression?
Well, it was, I had the experience of people, hypnotherapists around me. Like the first one was at the College of Psychic Studies in London. And then there were other people who I contacted over the years. And so I'd been taken through past life regressions and I had this great interest in hypnosis. And when I wanted to become trained as a hypnotherapist, I did a lot of searching around, and it seemed like there were some courses where they'd maybe do just a weekend, 8 hours on a Saturday and Sunday, and give you a certificate and say, hey, you're a hypnotherapist now. And I thought, that's no good. You can't really learn to do this like that. So I went on an extensive course that was 10 months and 160 hours of classroom time and so much work outside of that. And eventually I handed in a portfolio that was 78,000 words And, it went to the National Council for Hypnotherapy. Well, that's where I got my diploma. And that's the recognized body in the UK for hypnotherapy. So I felt that I got full proper training, because, you don't want to go to a hypnotherapist who hasn't really been trained and is just kind of making it up as they go along. And it was a thing where I was helping people lose weight and stop smoking. And I had particular success in stopping smoking. And lots of people would come to me for that. And that came out of word of mouth. But at the same time, all I really wanted to do was past life regressions. And so that's when I started to seek out doing a course in past life regression therapy. And I wanted it to be extensive and not just a weekend again, or not just watching a couple of videos online and then you get your certificate. So that was what was so good about your course, is that we could do all those Zoom calls and you could connect me with other students and we could practice the past life regression on each other, and all these questions that needed to be answered, and we'd go over all these things. And that's where I got my confidence to do past life regression therapy, is studying your course and combining that with everything I'd learned from the previous course and all my experience from it before.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense. So on the course that you'd done initially, you wanted to do past life regression, but you really wanted to get that foundation in hypnotherapy. So as you were doing that, what was their attitude to past life regression? Was that a little bit part of the hypnotherapy course, or was that something of interest to a lot of other people there, or not so much?
It was not a part of the course at all. And the guy that did the training, he was what he called a hypnosis nerd. So he tried everything, and he had a blog on his site where he did a past life regression and saw a previous life. So he knew all about it. But I think what he wanted was for his courses to have this kind of reputation. And there's certain parts, of the society, or perhaps of the hypnotherapy community, that would see past life regression as not legitimate in some way. And so he didn't want to have that as part of his reputation. So that there was nothing about it in that course at all.
Okay, yeah, that's an understandable strategic choice. And I've sort of made the exact opposite one, which is I am an NGH HIP certified hypnotherapy trainer, but I chose to call myself the Past Life Awakening Institute. But it's an interesting strategic decision not to emphasize it, and for some of those cultural reasons, which makes perfect sense. That's something that you've then gone on to really investigate and explore. Is that part of what has given you that sort of really investigative approach?
Yeah, because I feel like I don't know if it's a male thing or a Western thing, but I'm looking for evidence and a kind of logical examination of it, and trying to avoid what you might call the hairy fairy woo stuff, and not just believing anything I hear straight away. And I've done over 170 episodes now on my podcast. Each one is an hour-long interview, and just about every guest has a book out. And to find the questions that I want to ask them, because I really try and go in depth. So I'll read their book in the lead up to the interview. So, I've probably read 150 of these books before I've interviewed the author. And so for me, it's been a great education. But in the decades before that, I was reading tons of books anyway. And I've got a book right here.
Yep. Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, Ian Stevenson.
Ian Stevenson was a professor of psychiatry, I think it was, at University of Virginia. And he's got over 2,600 cases of children that remember past lives. And so many of them were verified. And so that's what I like about it, this kind of verification and looking for evidence, is that these children would say all this stuff, and then he'd use that information and track down the original family and verify that life existed and everything the child was saying was real. And in this book, I find this sort of thing fascinating. If you see that, one of those guys is Ian Stevenson's interpreter, the old guy there, and the other guy next to him is from the same country. They're both in Burma or Myanmar.
Yep.
But the boy, he remembers life as an American pilot. And he was shot down over Burma during the Second World War. And you could see in his picture there how he looked so much paler than the man he was with, and he had blonde hair and blue eyes. And it's a suggestion that that life as an American has come through into this life and affected him physically in some way. And so that's another verification of all the memories that he has. And he had so much description about the aircraft and the people he was with and the life of that pilot and the name. But the thing is that for that life, they couldn't track down the life. But that book is full of these cases of people who have marks on their body or deformities at birth that relate directly to their past life memories. And so I see that kind of verification as so fascinating. And also when I see verifications that are just as powerful in near-death experiences, and then I talk to near-death experiencers and they talk about during their time, what you could say is in the afterlife, they have discussed reincarnation. They were told all about reincarnation while they were in that space. And everything they talk about is so similar to what we might talk about with past life regression. So I love all these kind of verifications. And also this helps me if I'm doing a session with somebody and they talk about something happening during the session that might be in that afterlife space. If we take them through the death of the past life and they talk about things that I have knowledge about because I've investigated near-death experiences. So it's an interesting crossover, and it also helps with that kind of therapy, or maybe not the therapeutic side, but in the hypnosis, if somebody tells me something and I didn't know anything about it from near-death experiences or doing the podcast, I might be at a loss. I might start floundering and not quite know what questions to ask or how to guide them. So it's been very useful as part of past life regression therapy to have all that background knowledge.
That makes sense. Through a lot of the research and the stories that you've heard, that doesn't then create a block of doubting, wondering, questioning. You can just sort of get on with it and get the narrative and get to some of the therapeutic resolutions. And I think maybe that happens sort of culturally as well. You know, I've lived in Asia for 20 years, so they don't ask me a lot of questions. Is reincarnation true, or is this just some strange Asian idea? You know, in Asia, that question's not there. They're just like, of course they are, and let's get on with the therapy. It depends on the kind of people you're working with. There can be some of those conscious questions to go through, you know, explain what is reincarnation, how does it work, is it really real? And some of these evidences are really important before they can allow their conscious mind to go to the background and let their subconscious come to the forefront. And that can happen individually. I think it can happen as an entire culture. When you started out, you know, in the late 80s, culturally, past lives was a kind of an out there woo-woo strange thing. But Brian Weiss and a lot of books and your podcast helps people understand and accept and know it in a lot of details how it works, and therefore question it less and allow them to access some of their inner wisdom more. Do you see things as developing that kind of way?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot more knowledge and acceptance of reincarnation in the West in certain areas. I occasionally get clients from the United States and they might say, look, you know what, I'm in the Bible Belt and I'm doing this past life regression, but I'd never tell my mum I'm doing this, or because she's such a strong Christian, you know. And so I suppose there are still barriers there, but, you know, there was that Netflix series recently called Surviving Death, and one of the episodes there was all about children that remember past lives. So it's getting more mainstream and people are learning more about it.
And for me, the key thing there is just that people see it as a credible therapy. And I'm sort of curious now about even the kind of people that you do work with.
Yeah, it's mostly the people that listen to my podcast. Occasionally there's people who, you know, it's word of mouth, or somebody will listen to the podcast and they'll have told somebody you should try this kind of thing. Because I don't know if you ever get this, but people say to you, you know, it's almost like you're my last resort. I've tried everything else. But yeah, it's mostly people that listen to the podcast, and some of them have so much knowledge about it. So if you're doing a free consultation call beforehand, you don't have to go into all sorts of details and explanations, and they may have done past life regressions before with other people. Occasionally, there's somebody who doesn't really know anything about it, but it's been recommended. If it's all right to talk about one person I work with,
Sure.
she came to me because her brother said she should try this, and she's had this terrible guilt, and she just doesn't know where it comes from. She's felt really guilty, and I took her, and we went through 3 different lives, and in each one there was this something that happened that caused tremendous guilt. And so it was like really compounded across those 3 lives. And afterwards, she just looked so bewildered. And she said to me, she said, I don't understand. I don't know what's just happened to me with this hypnosis. And she felt that there's something had been lifted off her, like some weight, something psychological, just by having knowledge of these lives. And I also went through that process of breaking the bonds of time to try and help her release this energy. So it was fascinating that she knew nothing about it, and she went into those 3 past lives, and they were all linked, and there was so much insight for her. And I asked her to email me back and let me know how she's getting on. So I'm looking forward to getting an email from her, and hopefully it's been really positive.
I think there's a difference even between, I understand hypnosis, hypnotherapy, and I've recalled some past lives, and I've had deeply emotional insights which relate directly to presenting issues in this life. And that when I go back into a past life, I have really moving experiences.
It's often I see people wiping tears from their eyes, and they might not really be crying or weeping, but they're just talking, and constantly tears are coming out of their eyes. And sometimes it's they could be in something in a past life that's not particularly emotional, but still something's coming through there, and it does seem to be quite a release, some kind of emotional, it's cathartic to do that.
Exactly. Just even the basic insight, that emotive response is part of the evidence. So that's a wonderful experience as a therapist. And that sort of gives you the evidence that, oh, this is worth doing.
Yeah. And it's a thing where they may be very tearful during the hypnosis and they look so unhappy, but when you bring them out of it towards the end of the session, they'll be going, oh, that was amazing. That was so brilliant. And I feel so much better. So it's interesting that it's almost like you make people cry for a living, and they pay you for it, and they're happy about it.
Well, that's a great point. And I think that's what you need to really understand as a healer. And I think a lot of people fall into a trap of somebody cries or seems to be in pain or is going through something traumatic, and then they want to jump in and heal it. I think the more you can sit with it, explore it, gather the narrative, learn about it, to be able to process that. So, in fact, is that something that you find, like, what are the consequences of that?
I get emails from podcast listeners who say that they may have lost somebody and they're searching for something that they'd never looked for it before, but having a past life regression in some way verifies that there is an afterlife. And so it can help when you're grieving for someone. And, I had a client, she wanted to do a past life regression, and she mentioned that her son had died maybe a year ago. And she got to this point, she was a little girl in the kitchen, and it looks about the Victorian era. And she said, oh, my brother's just walked in the room. And I said, you mean the brother in the past life family? She said, no, my brother from this life. And he says he's come just to tell me that he's okay. And so that was a weird, spontaneous thing that happened there, because I had said to her when we started is that, if she was looking for something, some kind of communication like that, then it's pretty much not going to happen. And we can't guarantee anything like that would happen. And so that's only a couple of times that something like that. And she had a kind of double benefit when we did the therapy of that session, and she had that contact with her brother. And I think that was quite life-changing for her. And on another level, there's kind of little changes, I suppose. There was a woman who had back pain, and she went to a past life where she was in a motorbike accident, her father in that life was riding the bike and she was a passenger, and her father died in the crash and she broke her back in that crash. And since then, she emailed me and she said that whenever she thought about that regression, she got this nice warm feeling in her back where the pain was. And there was some relief from the pain. It wasn't 100% relief, but from the sessions, it definitely helped. And so there's that kind of small sort of change that helps with something physical pain like that. And like I said, there was something that gave her something, this other client with her son, it gave her something that I don't think you could get anywhere else. If you sit with a medium and you get some verifiable information, it's not the same as actually seeing it in your mind's eye and getting that connection yourself.
Yeah, that's a great point. I often think about it as we're enabling a sort of a psychic capacity within our clients, and it's an inner wisdom that comes from them, and it's their deep felt experience. I think that's really helpful. So, and all of this came because you went from a deep interest in the subject and a curiosity about it, and then that evolved into working with other people. So I'm a bit curious to go through a bit of your healer's path. So about where you grew up, and even before you got into past life regression, or then before hypnotherapy, what were even some of your earliest influences? Is it something that you were interested in as a kid? And so where did you grow up? What was the culture around healing? Have you always been interested in spiritual healing, or what started the journey for you?
Yeah, well, I was born in West London. I grew up in West London, and we weren't a religious family, and I didn't have any friends that were religious. So I've always been on the outside when it comes to religion. But it was never a thing where we were strong atheists. And I always had an interest in the supernatural and paranormal. And, I remember as 10 years old, I'd go to the local public library and I would take books out on ghosts and Bigfoot and UFOs. And over time, it's like some of those subjects kind of fell by the wayside. And it really came down to this interest in the afterlife and seeing things where there could be some kind of verification. And for some reason, I had an interest in UFOs as well. And it's only recently, in the last few years, I've seen a connection between the afterlife and UFOs. But it was in the 80s, the early 80s. I read Shirley MacLaine's books because my mum was a big fan of Shirley MacLaine. She read those books and she thought, oh, I think Simon would be interested in this stuff as well. So, and then there was the book by Raymond Moody, Life After Life, which was fascinating. And then I started going to see mediums. And as far as the healer's path goes, it's interesting. I saw mediums in the late 80s at the College of Psychic Studies. They would be training mediums. So you could book a cheap session with one of the trainees or an expensive session with one of the teachers. So I do both. And there were 3 or 4 of them said to me, you're going to be a healer later in life. And at that time I thought, oh, don't be ridiculous. But it's weird that it's come true. And it's almost that thing where you think, did I do this because they told me I was going to do it, or did they actually have some insight and know that I was going to do it? So the idea to take on healing and do the clinical hypnotherapy was only fairly recent, I suppose, maybe 10 years ago that I started looking at that.
Okay, interesting. And so what kind of things had you done before then? I know you play bass, you write science fiction. What other kind of things, career-wise or life experiences, do you think contributed or were like transferable skills once you did get more seriously into professional healing?
I'd like to think that I've got empathy and not judgmental. And I think, and there's that thing. If you have a client, you take them on board. If you're going to work with them, then you're not judgmental of anything they say. You have to accept them 100% for who they are and work with them. You can't be criticizing them or talking down to them at all. And I'd like to think that, like, for my whole life, I've always been very accepting of people, no matter what they're like and who they are. And I suppose that could be a transferable skill. But I don't know if creativity adds to it. Do you think creativity would add to it?
I think so. I think, and like, I know you're a musician, and even, you understand audio. So I think that was a transferable skill for your podcast. You knew how to record good audio, and then you figured out, hey, I can do this with my other hobby. And so, that's one thing I think that helped your podcast. But absolutely, a creativity, and which is part of a musical mindset. I think that creativity is really important for therapists. And within music's very creative, but it's also very structured and has a lot of technical aspects that you need to be good at as well. And I think that applies very much to therapy. Some people can be very creative but not very structured, and other people can be very structured but less creative. And I think we really have to be both to be a good therapist, and probably the same to be a good musician. They're very disciplined, and there's a real mechanics to it. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I suppose something I've been thinking about is I got a bass guitar when I was 15, and I became obsessed with it. And when I left school, I didn't get a job, and I played bass, and I would get up, 9 o'clock in the morning, and I would play bass till say 6 o'clock in the evening. That really was every minute of every hour. I was just obsessed with it, and I wanted to get things perfect. And there were all these complicated bass lines on all these records I had, and I had to learn them and get them right. And so after a few years of playing like that and getting to what I would call a high standard, if I could just be immodest for a moment, to being that kind of a virtuoso on an instrument, what it taught me about myself is that if I put the work in, then I can achieve something. And so when it came to studying hypnotherapy and going on that course, or studying anything, I knew that I had to put the work in, but I also knew if I did put the work in, I could accomplish what I needed to. I could get to that point. And I think when I did the course originally, there were 30 people on it over 10 months. And there were only 3 of us that handed in all the coursework at the end of the 10 months. All the other people, there was like a 6-month leeway where after the end of the course, you had to hand it in within 6 months. But I knuckled down and got it done. So I suppose having that knowledge of yourself that you can accomplish something if you put the work in, that helped me. And that still helps me. And it also teaches you have to pay attention to the small things and the details.
I think that's a great message for a lot of people. A lot of people are hobbyists. A lot of people have vague curiosities in many things. But I think the difference between being a professional healer and having a certificate is what you're talking about, is this kind of obsession, I think, obsessively wanting to get bass really right, and doing that for years to know that you can get there. And I think really to be a good therapist, you do need to have a compelling motivation or an inner drive. You could call it an obsession to really understand it, and to not think that you know a little bit and now you're done. The self-understanding that, hey, I need to do a lot more practice to get what I could call good. I think a lot of people have a bit more confidence than they've earned, and it's really helpful to really know that it's a long journey, and it takes a lot of work. And I think even like being a writer is really important as a therapist. So, as you mentioned, you had 78,000 words that you had to submit, and most people didn't, and you did. And the training that I do as well, it's really emphasizes writing case studies, putting it into practice directly and then writing it up. It's quite easy to think, oh, I watched a video and I did a session, it went quite well. But to really examine it and to write about it and to discuss it and to go over it and to think about it, I think it multiplies it. So did you find that kind of thing with the training that you did and the case studies for the Past Life Awakening Institute? Do you find that writing aspect helpful?
Yeah. And to do it after the session, not say, oh, okay, I'll do that in a couple of days. You've got to do it while you remember it and it's all clear in your mind. And I also record every session. So I send the recording to the client, but then that's also really useful to go back to listen to, because there's always, I suppose you can listen back to it and think, oh, you know what, I should have asked them this thing, or I should have done that, or I could have worded that better. So it's self-critical it's that thing of not to think, hey, I'm fantastic, I got it all sorted out. And that there have been people who are past life regression therapists that I've interviewed over the years on the podcast, and they have books out, and these books have transcripts of sessions they've done. So, I went through a process of getting all those books together and reading through all those transcripts and seeing what questions do they ask, and can I bring those questions in to what I'm doing, and maybe even looking for bad things as well, so you know what to avoid.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to do that, to replay. What in my early days, I used to do a session and then sort of do some self-hypnosis on myself. I replay the whole session and remember what I did well and think, oh, that's good, I'll do more of that. And then think, oh, exactly what you said. Oh, I could have said this or that there. And then I'll make a note of it and maybe I'll catch it in the next session. And then what happens is you do that enough that, you've got staircase wit, which is you think of the right thing to say as the guests are leaving, but then your wit catches up and you become faster, so that you've got the wit and you've got the right reply, and you've just done it so many times. But I find that, you can do it once in reality, but then, we're hypnotists, let's use hypnosis. So I'd sort of go through my sessions hypnotically and do them again, but better in a hypnotic state myself. And so rather than do just one session and learn a bit from it and sort of forget about it, have lunch, I'll replay it in my mind, write it up, and reconsider, read, watch videos again, and think, and then get more ideas about how you can improve it. So that way, eventually you become like very quick in the moment. But I think that's a great way, and that there's a kind of obsessiveness in that. But I think that sort of is the difference between an okay or good and getting really great at it. And you do that for your 10,000 hours, and you get there. And I think that's really important for people that are interested in really taking it to that professional level. Putting in that kind of work is useful, and just knowing that the payoff comes. So I really like that. You got that evidence from your bass playing, that, and I really like those metaphors. For a lot of times, you learn a few chords, but then as you just keep on playing and keep practicing, then you really get into a flow.
Yeah, it's just I just thought about you learn the chords. It's like learning a technique in hypnosis, and you can use all the combinations of the chords in each song, and you have the same chords in every song, but they come in a different order. And it's the same with techniques and sessions. It's almost like each one's a different song, you use the same chords but in a different order. Is that making sense?
It does. It really does. I really like that. I hadn't really thought of it in that way, because I find one thing, when I teach people, they often, firstly, what you said was, it gives me the confidence to go ahead and do it in the first place. So that is a first thing. So the confidence just to pick up the guitar and be a little bit punk rock and just say, I know the first three chords, but I'm going to get up on stage and do it anyway. But then people still go, but I still feel a little bit clunky. And it's like, that's okay. And then they lose confidence and then they never do it again. And oh yeah, I was a past life therapist once, and I did sort of 20 sessions, and I met a couple of clients who were quite difficult, and that was it. And so part of the approach that I take is mentoring people through, which is give them a little push, get up there, the three chords, and to find that as they go along, that there's a bit of clunkiness, and that's okay. And you will get better, you will get smoother. So it's the confidence to get up on stage, and then it's the confidence to persist and build competence and know that you will get virtuoso eventually. But whatever blocks or clunkiness that you feel, and that feels uncomfortable, but don't let that stop you. And then exactly right. And once you become less clunky, you realize, and people often cling to like the script or the process. So it's got to be, G, E, D, or whatever chords are. But then they're like, oh, okay, well, it was supposed to be a G. I don't know that one, but then they showed up with an A minor. And so like, oh, and then I sort of heard about that chord, but I never had to use it. And now they start using it, and they're like, and then they start to feel, now I can be creative. You told us it's supposed to be this structure, and it is. But I also tell all my students, like, there's a flexibility there. You can be creative but only within the rules of music. So, you can't just choose chords that are in different keys. In music, you have the discipline. Your chords must be within the same key, otherwise it's going to be all over the place. But as long as those chords are within the same key, then you can be creative and go with whatever's coming up from their subconscious. And then that's when you get that real competence and flow and confidence, and and enjoy it. And that's when people sort of lock in. It goes from, I'm a little bit nervous about doing sessions, or I did a session, I sort of was a bit critical of myself. So we can sort of be non-judgmental to other people. And a lot of people find that quite easy. But to be non-judgmental to yourself is quite important as well. And to say, that's okay, I was a bit clunky and I should have said this or that. I'm like, hey, that's why we have, 3 to 5 sessions. You just get it next time and keep doing it for a few more sessions, and then you'll be getting it in the moment. And then you start, jamming, and then you're having a really good time. Then you can't stop doing sessions. So I think, that's sort of just to extend the metaphor fully. So do you find that, is that metaphor still working?
Yeah. It's the thing about the jamming and enjoying it and finding different ways of doing things, and learning by yourself, like reading the books and finding more stuff, and then trying it out in a session. If you think it's appropriate, then that can be really good to learn that. That's like learning something at home and then taking it to a jam.
Absolutely, yeah, that's definitely part of it. And so you mentioned, as part of the Past Life Awakening Institute, I match up fellow students, and all the students are at a pretty high level. And so, and that's a safe space with which to get on stage in the first place and to try out a few things. So did you find that was, so one thing, it's like do a lot of work, write it up. But the other thing is like, here are people to work with. So did you find it helpful to have that as a resource as well, as part of the training?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's really important, I think, because if you're sitting there and it's a proper client, they paid you money, and you can really feel under pressure for that. And your first few sessions, it could mess you up a little bit because you're so worried about your own performance. But if you go through doing sessions with people who haven't paid you, and in a way they know you're a student, they're not expecting you to be perfect. And so if you do mess up a little bit, it doesn't matter so much. And it's also, you can talk about the student with it, and they might have ideas that can help you, and you might have ideas that can help them. And it's like you say, it's a safe space, and you don't have to put all that pressure and stress on yourself. And you won't you might worry that the client will think you're stupid because they think, why did I pay all this money for this idiot? But with the fellow students, you can get away with being an idiot.
Yeah, I find that a big issue with a lot of students. And I do try and push people and say, with the mentoring that you're getting from me, with the curriculum that I'm taking you through, you deserve to be paid. You're earning it. But still, people have, it is that state. And it's not and I kind of like it in a way, which is, it's like there's more competence than confidence. And we can increase the confidence as we go along. And once you've done that a couple of times, then you can go out and feel confident to do it with the clients. But just that first initial step is a big one. So a lot of people do quite a lot of free sessions. And to be honest, I've never done a free session in my life. Like from day one, it was just like I did a couple of very minor practice things on my in-person training, a long time ago. And then it was just practicing, and it's just come in and pay. So I never done it. I recommend people to really get paid as early as you can. And I think that's really helpful. But just that little barrier of, and it's not a competence barrier, because I think you've got the ability, but it's just that feeling. And so it's an inner state. And once that state shifts because you then see the value. So I'll say to people, like, you don't understand, at the end of these 3 sessions, they're going to have so much value. And I know that because I've seen my students do it. And they'll know that then. I know it now, and you'll find it out later. And then you'll go, oh, I wish I'd charged, or, oh, I did create value, and you're investing in getting good by doing this kind of training anyway, where I mentor you through it, and I'm sort of assisting along and making sure everything's sort of heading in the right direction. And part of the assessment at the beginning to make sure if it's an appropriate person, or that preparation, I think people can charge right away. But just to get over that hump is something that is a big benefit a lot of people get. So by the time you do graduate and you're working with people, then you can just really have fun with it. And as a contrast to being like a little bit nervous about what people are thinking of you, to like having fun and being really clear and confident, at peace with yourself as a therapist, is so helpful to them as a client.
Yeah, I think there's some people who may worry about charging, who don't feel they should charge it when they start out, but the client's paying for your time and your expertise. And I think there may also be a feeling that if you're supposed to be taking someone through a past life regression and they just don't go into the hypnosis, maybe they're really anxious about it, they can't relax, they can't follow the guidance. And then at the end of the session, people might think, well, I better give them their money back because they didn't go into a past life. But actually, they're paying for your time and your expertise. And if you go through the process properly, as you do with everyone else, it's not down to your incompetence. They didn't get into a past life. It's this somebody who just can't relax enough and follow the guidance. And it's very rare, but it happens to me. It has happened to me twice out of all the sessions I've done.
Right. It is quite a rare thing. And I think even, and one way to even avoid even the very rarest of times is to really assess upfront and to make sure it's really appropriate. And a lot of times I find, we're wanting to regress to a causative event in the past to help them. And we can assume that it's past life regression or try and dictate to them that it is. But oftentimes that causative event in the past can easily be in this life. And so that even when I teach past life regression therapy, we often spend a reasonable amount of time in the first session going back to this life, because then that will then connect into past lives. And that's even, it's a smaller jump and it can give people a feeling of success, but people can often sort of frame it as being a failure. Whereas they'll say, I went back and had a cathartic release and discovered a memory from when I was 5 that I didn't know about. And that was really powerful, but you failed me because we didn't go into a past life. And you're like, hang on a second. And so a lot of times people will grab defeat out of the jaws of victory, or little things like that. So a lot of the times I think that's one of the reasons why, I like the fact that you've done your hypnotherapy as a base, and I do teach that as a base in past life regression. So a lot of times there are good reasons and therapeutic resolutions you can get to without a past life. So does that make sense? And do you see that? Do you find that this life regression is something that comes up even if people set an intention to go for past lives, that important this life stuff can come up and maybe surprise you both?
I haven't had that. I've had the, we take people back to a point of peaceful confidence as part of the process. And I have it a couple of times where people have just gone straight into a past life at that point. And even though when you're going through it, you say, we'll take you back to a point in this life, and they completely jump somewhere else. And it's that thing, it's that idea that your higher self or your spirit guides are choosing which life you might view. And it's almost like the spirit guides us like, no, forget all that. Don't mess about with all that rubbish. Come on, we got to get on with it.
Right. Well, that's the exact opposite problem. You're like, sometimes I ask people to go back into a past life, and very occasionally they won't. But sometimes I ask them just as a warm up, go into this life, and they just jump straight ahead into a past life. And that seems like much more common. So it's much more likely they'll go into a past life, even if you're not even trying, rather than trying hard and not getting there, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's one of those things with experience. You got to learn to adapt and try and work out what's going on, because occasionally that's happened. And I said, so where are you in this place of peaceful confidence? And they'll just start talking about something that doesn't sound unhappy or anything, but it just doesn't sound right. You think, hang on a second, is this a past life or is this a current life? So sometimes there's that little sort of subtlety. You're not quite sure where they are, if it's a past life or current life. You have to learn how to spot that and then know how to deal with it.
Absolutely. In my earlier days, I went into quite long stories, and it was only, 30 minutes in, I realized, oh, it's not this life, or it's a past life. And so that definitely can happen, can happen a lot. And I think, for newer students, I think a lot of hypnotherapists, I think they may take people through regressions and never realize they'd actually done a past life regression and think, oh, this was just some episode of their earlier life. I think that actually that can happen to people who want to do credible hypnotherapy and not get into the strange past life stuff. think a lot of people have the experience where they either they know about it and don't talk about it, or um, things like that can come up anyway. So I'm sort of curious about some individual case studies, and I really like the way you've sprinkled in some details here and there. I'm kind of curious about maybe some with it. Sort of give the journey from the beginning to end. Can you give us an example of some therapy clients that have come in and found out that past lives are really relevant to this life issues, and it really helps them in the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Sometimes I've had somebody come to me with a very specific problem. There was a woman who had this thing with she'd have very nasty headaches and her jaw would be locking up, and she wanted help with this muscle. I think the headaches was probably caused by her locking her muscles up on her jaw. And so we went into a past life regression, and she saw herself as a young girl, maybe an adolescent, on the back of a motorbike with her father, and her father crashed the bike, and she had a broken back in that accident. Her father died. And afterwards she was saying, you know what, I've always had this pain in my lower back and I didn't know where it came from. So that's a kind of weird thing where we were targeting one thing in the therapy, but whoever chooses the past lives you see chose something else. It was almost like they were thinking, no, we're not going to go where you want to go at the moment. We're going to go to this other place. And so working on the jaw came up like in the next session. And there was also another crossover there, which was a bit weird, where she went to a life where she had several children and the father had left and she didn't have enough money to feed the children. And she recognized one of the small boys as her son in this life. And the son in this life has always had stomach upsets every week. And in that past life, that boy died because she couldn't feed him. She didn't have enough money to feed all the children. And in the week after that, her son had no stomach problems at all. And it was almost like there was some kind of energy release with her that affected her son. But I don't know if it's just she started treating him in a different way, her behavior changed the way he went, or maybe she fed him slightly differently so he didn't get the stomach aches. But what I think I did this a while ago with that lady. I don't think we ever got to the thing with her jaw and her muscles locking up, but other things came up on the way. So that's definitely an interesting one. And it was a life where I think it was some kind of Victorian time where they were very poor and the husband left there. She had 7 children.
Okay.
And, I wonder about that kind of energetic connection between her son in that previous life and how she recognized him as being her son in this life, and also having stomach problems, which was related to food. And you see a past life connection there, and that's something you see in those sessions, isn't it, where somebody will be in a past life and they'll recognize somebody in that past life is with them in this life. And that's part of the therapeutic thing. Sometimes you see them repeating patterns across lives of how they treat each other, or what things come up.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And so one interesting thing there is, we talk about past life regression, but we've got multiple lives there. And so you've got, one life about being the daughter with her dad on the back of a motorcycle. And another life, she's the mother with a boy, and in Victorian times. Is that something that you see a lot? Clients not just having a past life, but having multiple past lives?
Yeah. It's a thing where in a session, what I would prefer to do is just go through one life and examine that and get into the detail, but spontaneously they'll jump to other lives sometimes. And so you see it occasionally, and even I've had a couple of times somebody's jumped to a life on, seems like it's another planet. And it's sometimes I feel that I'm asking the client a question and there's just silence for ages. And I think something's going on with their regression. They're seeing something, but they don't want to tell me because maybe they don't want to appear foolish or something like that. And It does jump to different past lives, and we'll see a past life. Like I had somebody who went back to ancient Egypt. They were just an ordinary person, and then they jump forward a few hundred years, and they jump forward a few hundred years again. And I couldn't see a connection between the lives. And I think maybe there was some kind of a connection. And I suppose with experience, you learn which questions to ask to try and find stuff. But when they're a pauper in the ancient Egypt and then they're very rich a few hundred years later, and the two lives are so different, and I couldn't work out why they might have jumped between the two and if there should be a connection.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, I asked the question, that is something I do see a lot. And I think that's one of the benefits of doing a few sessions. And so one of them is, the first session, you can get a certain past life. And oftentimes you'll get that past life narrative and then you'll go and resolve it in a second or third session. But often you get, a lot of detail about one life and you think, okay, we're done. That's, they had a jaw problem. They hurt their jaw then. They had relationship problems. Their daughter was this, their dad was that. Okay, good. But then they launch into a whole nother past life. And so, we have to make these connections between this life and the past life and who were they, and the balancing patterns, the repeating patterns. And oftentimes I do see this contrast where they're rich in one life and poor in another one. And this is, for a diversity of experience. It, varies a lot with the specific lessons, but we're in there, we can ask the spirit guide, what particular, when we do a life review, what particular lessons did they learn? What was the benefit of being poor in this life? What did that teach them? And vice versa, if they're wealthy. And I think it's really helpful to have those really contrasting lives. And you can figure out as you go through the sessions, by the time you get to the third session, you might also, it's that same thing where, you gather the first life in the first session, you get a whole nother life in the second session, and you're still like, oh, now I could have seen a connection, or I could have asked this, or I wonder if they're connected like this, so we can connect this life to one life. But now we have to connect the two past lives to each other and see what they're communicating, what meaning is in there, what spiritual lessons are being taught through that. And we may only think of that in reflection when we think back on the session. But if we do, and we bring them in for a third session, then we're ready and we can say the things that we wished we'd said the first time. So I think that's one of the benefits of having this a 3 to 5 session structure. And I think that part that you made there about sometimes people going to another planet and being slow or maybe embarrassed to say things, I get that similar kind of reaction. But what I tend to find is that people tend to go to like other planet past lives when it's the third session. So by that time, they know you, they trust themselves, they know that you're not judgmental, and they will then, go into and still say, oh, I know this is a bit weird, but I'll just honestly tell you what's happening and go into it. And for me, those kind of things tend to come up a lot in the third session. And so I think that's sort of one of the benefits of having like an ongoing therapeutic relationship with people. And just from a therapeutic point of view, that really holds true as well, because people might come in and say, I've got this issue with my sister, but they don't really want to tell you about sort of sexual abuse with the uncle. And certainly the first time you meet them, maybe not in the first session, but by the second or third session, they're like, okay, I've seen you being able to help me with my mild to moderate issue. Now I feel comfortable to tell you about my really serious issue. And this is actually why I really want the first 2 sessions have kind of been a test. And now I trust you and I know that you can help me. And so now I'm going to give you the hard one. And so they can do that consciously and directly by going from like the presenting issue to the real issue, or their subconscious can do it, which is now she's ready to, before she was struggling to understand what is reincarnation, are past lives even real or credible, or are they just some weird thing? And over the 2 sessions in a few weeks, they sort of digest it. And now they're like, okay, I think past lives are a real thing. And then they're ready for a next stage. And then we get into a third session and it can come up. So have you noticed that kind of progression with your clients, during the therapeutic process?
I haven't so much. No, I have. When the Lives on Other Planets came up, it was very much the end of the session, and they did seem reluctant to tell me about it. There's been a couple of times where I've been in a space with someone and asked them, what's happening over here with these people, or they'll be outside a room. There was one, they were outside this room and they could hear a baby crying. And I said, well, let's see what's happening? Can you go in there? And they said, no, the door's open, but it's black. And it's not like the room light has been switched off. It's like there's a black barrier there. And I wondered if there was something in the subconscious that was blocking it. It was almost like, well, we can take you this far in this past life, but you wouldn't be able to handle what's going on inside that room. Do you ever get something like that?
Yeah, there can be, and there can be a whole bunch of reasons for that. And I think a lot of times it can be some of the preliminary therapy is useful to be done. So oftentimes I will do not even just a preparation of like going into a little bit of a past life before we get into the past lives properly. I'll often do 2 sessions of hypnotherapy, and I find that's pretty helpful, and that can help alleviate that issue. Or what you can do is you can even do as much past life regression as you can do, and then go backwards to do some hypnotherapy. You do that, and then you go back and do more past life regression, and suddenly those doors are open. So that's one way. It's sort of like if you really go deep into some of the prerequisites, that can really open up doors for the past life regression. And another part of it can be, there can be like post requisites, which is particularly the life on other planets. For me, you're getting quite close to between lives regression therapy, or there can even be spirit releasement. So there can be entities that are blocking for some reason, and that block may be, they're not ready, and it's actually, and a block's not a bad thing, which is they need to integrate it in, do a bit of hypnotherapy, or live for another 6 months and have certain experiences, and then just come back and everything's fine. Or maybe there is something actively blocking, in which case you can address it, and or even as you said, another reason can literally just be logistics. So you said, it was right at the end of the session and they didn't really get into it. And that can just be timing. They know if they've only got 5 minutes left, they're like, well, we'll pick that up next time. And you could do, a 2-hour between life session and get the full story. And it can just like be time. They don't want to, well, we haven't got time for it. We'll just come back and do it next time. And so, so there are many reasons, but they can be some of them.
Yeah. I think I've been lucky with that. If you can do a long session and you only really start getting to the meat of it and you're running out of time and you've got another session to start in 5 minutes. So you have to kind of close it off in some way, in a good way, so that you can go back to it when you do the next session. And also, I suppose you don't want the person to be spending the next week or so before the next session to be feeling really bad about it. So I think I've been lucky that it's very rare that that's happened to me. But would you have advice for if somebody's really into it and you've got another call in 5 minutes?
Well,
What you do?
I tend to have buffers. So that's the first one, which is like I'll schedule 90 minutes, but I'll have a 30-minute buffer. And so I'm not back to back. So that's just one logistical one. But another one can be, I think this actually comes a little bit with experience, which is knowing, and it's actually really, you have to have quite a lot of experience. And you've got a little inner clock, which means like, you've got 90 minutes and there's a little voice in your head that says at 50 minutes or whatever it is, we need a hustle. So just like that, you're the subconscious, you said, sometimes they're really saying, we don't want to mess around with this, let's just get onto it. And so their inner wisdom will do that. I think oftentimes your inner wisdom sort of can kick in and get pretty good at moving along, and so that you do have time, and the pacing of sessions is quite an advanced skill that does come with a bit of experience. And also, but you also make a great point, which is at the end of the day, sometimes there's nothing you can do. You just will logistically run out of time. But this is one of the benefits of, if you're a one and done approach, then you've got a real problem, or it's incomplete. You can still end it on a nice point, but it's like, there's more there, but you've got a one and done model. So I like a set, I've got even a 3-session process, even if that, but it's 3 to 5 sessions. So that's my little buffer zone that if, built into even the sessions, that if they need to come back. And another part can be just, the main thing is, is really just being able to wrap it up nicely and neatly, and to be able to do that in a short amount of time. And that is kind of a learned skill that you get. So a lot of times as a past life therapist, you can be a bit overwhelmed. And I've got this life, and I thought about it, and I was ready. I'd planned, and I reviewed the last session. I knew what I wanted to say in this session. I had a great idea. I was just about to resolve it, and then they brought up a whole nother past life, and then I was trying to figure out how they connected, and I didn't know quite how to wrap it up. And just the more you do, the more you're able to like click into it and see the connections, make those links, and wrap it up kind of neatly for the end of the session, so they do leave on a high good point. And a lot of times it is sort of knowing that like it doesn't have to be perfect, and there is always next time, and that it is what it is. If this is the time that you've got and you've only got 5 minutes left to wrap it up, then you can just find the words to do it in a way where they can then spend the next week satisfied that they got a bunch of information and patiently waiting for the next time. It's something which in the long term isn't a particularly big issue.
Yeah. Then there's the thing of that's dealing with the conscious mind, and how is the subconscious going to react? And I wonder why who or what chooses which past life you'll see. And there is that thing of targeting the therapeutic side and saying, we'll take this, we'll go to a past life that's related to your current life issues of this thing and that thing. And I also look at that. So if you didn't wrap it up at the end of a session, there's that other side of it where you might have talked to the person on their conscious side, but what is the subconscious doing? The subconscious knows that there'll be another session coming. And I also wonder, is it your higher self that's getting involved, your spirit guides? And then that takes me back to before it even starts, that it's almost like when you have the consultation call and you discuss what they want to do, is the spirit guides listening in and getting the idea of what the session's about?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of times, I mean, there may be times you sort of get to the end and think, oh, I'm running out of time and I've got to jump into another call. And that definitely does happen. But I think you could look at all the other times where it's like, oh, it all came together and knitted itself sort of perfectly just in the right amount of time. So I think that happens the majority of the time. Would you say that's right? That it all just sort of fits into place and you can wrap it up and hey presto, it was all just magically in the right amount of time, and we got exactly
Yeah.
where we needed to go, not 10 minutes later, not 10 minutes earlier, but it all just fitted in. Would you say that's also probably the most common experience?
Yeah. I think that's partly down to your guidance, but there's part of the sessions when you can say, okay, we're going to jump to the next significant event in that lifetime that's related to your current life, and it's knowing when you've exhausted the current past life scene, that you've got everything you need from it, so right now it's time to jump to another event.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. And so just even when you're in the middle of a past life session, that is something that also comes with just a lot of experience of knowing when to cut off a thread and when to follow one. If you cut it off too early, you miss out a lot of information. But if you don't, you end up spending too much of the session on something that doesn't really go anywhere. And that's something you can only learn by doing. And that is where the creativity, the decision making, your own personal intuition really comes to the forefront. And all of that is critical to you getting to the result that you wanted to in the allotted amount of time. Because if you end up, and so it's really not about, how do I wrap it up in the last 5 or 10 minutes? It's what decisions am I making halfway through the session, so that means that I've got a sense of completion by the time we get to the end. Another part is, even if you do run out of time a little bit, just being able to see some of the connections and wrap things up so that, and their subconscious, their superconscious knows what's going on. And I think they'll often assist. And that's part of the reason for blocks, which is you could start something with 10 minutes left and they know you're never going to be able to wrap this up, in that time. They know you've got a call without a buffer and that you just shouldn't be opening this can. Open it next time, therefore they'll block it, which is super helpful. They've gotten you out of trouble. They know, you're just about to hit a big emotional trigger. You don't want to do that now. Just save that for next time. And so they're really helping you with time management, so they're different.
Yeah. That's that thing that I wonder, if people come to do a past life regression because their subconscious, as you say, or the higher self is nudging them. It's like they're giving them a prod in the back saying, you need to do this now. And that's something I say to clients. They feel like they've had some kind of a push to do a session.
Yeah, that's very common. I mean, I'd see that with, I think most people really, just to be motivated enough to come and to show up. I think whether they know it or not, I think there's an element of being guided towards. I think most people, or almost everybody that comes, is guided to some degree or another. Some people know it explicitly. Some people may not, but it doesn't really matter, and some may figure it out along the way. So, as we sort of talk about some of these examples, I think it's really nice to talk about some of the logistics. So a lot of people listening are therapists in the making and have these things about, oh, I want a bit of a push and I only know 3 chords and just get out there and practice it. And some of these logistics about, how do you wrap it up? And I think it's really helpful. And then we get into some of these points where you're getting into the flow and you're connecting with your higher self and the client's higher self, and it's all just sort of falling into place. So what would you say some of the key principles to therapy that come through? Do you find some things where you see repeating patterns and events in people's lives, but then are there repeating patterns in terms of spiritual lessons? Like, do you see a lot of forgiveness coming through, or a lot of people dropping disempowering beliefs, or what are some of the key lessons that people get as a concept, or losing fear of death, or understanding karma? What kind of things come through the most for you?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of insight. If we go at the end of the session and we go to that kind of afterlife space, and we have the spirit guides to come forward and ask them some questions, and sometimes they can get a lot from that. And it seems that the communication is a kind of a knowledge dump or some kind of download, that they have such an understanding of the past life that they've seen. The spirit guide will tell them something, and then they can spend 5 minutes explaining what the spirit guide took 2 seconds to tell them. They just get this massive understanding. And they talk about how the insight they get from having that past life, how they realize that they've had this sort of problem before. They may be married to someone, and in their previous life they were married to that person, and they had the same problem as before. It's a repeating pattern, and they find that kind of insight to be really useful.
I think that comes back to what we're talking about, which is like, how do you wrap up a session or make sure it's done in time? And I find this piece that we tend to have this as part of the structure. We take people through the narrative and find it out about what happened. But then towards the end of the session, what we want to do in the last 10 or 15 minutes is bringing in their spirit guide for a life review. So that can then help us make sense of, what was, we saw them on a motorcycle with their father and their jaw and then their back and then their son and then another life. And as you're going through it, when do I cut it? When do I move on? What did it mean? How did it connect? I'm not quite sure. And a lot of times, then I'm nervous. Am I incompetent? What's my person going to think? But I think a lot of times you can relax and know that, and just, if you're not sure, just ask them the question, or bring their higher self out and ask their higher self. And hey presto, a lot of the time their higher self will come up with a lot of this really good wrap up information. So as you get more skilled, you can get pretty good at being able to wrap it up yourself. But if you're struggling to do that, definitely bring it. Part of the structure that I have in the courses is go to the spirit guide for a life review and let them do a lot of the wrap up. And then it's often at these times, and what are the spiritual lessons? And they can often give you amazing stuff. And what I found really nice is you might ask them in the interview, what spiritual lessons do you think these difficult experiences may be giving you? And they don't really know what you're talking about, or try and answer it in some sort of conscious, I read it in a book kind of a way. But then you go through all of these lies of ups and downs and tears and smiles, and then ask them the same question, and you just come up with mind-blowing wisdom.
Yeah. And also there's that thing of giving the client space, because you might ask a question and they just don't answer, and you learn that maybe you need to give them 20 or 30 seconds of silence, and then they'll say something. And sometimes I wonder if they've got the answer, they know what they know what they need, but they just don't want to tell me. And other times it seems like they need to process what's going on before they can say something. I think you have to learn that skill as well.
Yeah, a lot of times I think they even, I think you said it, they get information in a few seconds or even in a split second, and then they can spend 5 minutes trying to explain it. And for me, I'd say, I understand that you've got the Satori, the insight. Just allow that insight to go deeper into your subconscious mind and to integrate and to help you in your life going forward. And we don't need them to then consciously explain or understand it. A lot of times, people can consciously understand, oh, yes, I was born in this life and that relates to my life now and these lives connected. And so then we can wrap it up nicely and we feel good that we've sort of figured it out. But it doesn't always have to be that way. And oftentimes you're still not quite sure. And sometimes I'll even have people, they'll contact me like a month later. Oh, I've figured it out, you know? And so we're like, oh, I want to wrap it up perfectly in the last 10 minutes, or whether we know it or not, they've often figured out at some level. And this is what happens then, you bring them out and then there's the post talk. So I often discourage long post talks. In early days, I think it's quite useful for therapists because you, as a past life therapist, when you're just starting, you're thinking, am I doing it wrong? What's the client thinking of me? Are they judging me negatively? Did I do it wrong? Oh, I should have asked this. I've made a mistake. It's actually like a lot of musicians. They're like, they get off stage and go, oh, I missed one of the notes. And they're saying, oh, I was a bad performance. And the audience comes up and says, that was the best concert I've ever seen. You're amazing. You're a god. And the musician's going, oh, I missed a note. And no one knows you missed a note. No one cares. They had the time of their life. And so this is why I encourage post talks for newer therapists, because they can see that what their client's really thinking is, this is amazing. You're a magician. This is wonderful. I'm so grateful. This is great. And they would appreciate it. But in general, once you know that, then when people come out and in a post-hypnotic state, they may then be trying to like consciously understand and piece it together. And I would, rather than let their conscious mind come back and getting into a conscious mind discussion with them, I'd say, hey, let's spend most of our time just talking with the deep sub or super conscious mind, and just go and live your life and integrate it and figure it out. Sleep, dream, live life. We'll come back in a week and see what happened. And then they come
Yeah.
back with things like, oh, I have no idea. And at the end of the session, they're like, oh, I have no idea what that meant. I don't know if that helped or not. And then a week later, they're like, oh, my kid's stomach's better. And like, there's no way they can know that at the end of the session anyway. So why try and analyze it? But just let them go
Yeah.
live their life. And then a week later, what I do recommend is definitely interviewing people before their next session. And so get a catch up of all the things that have happened and whatever realizations or insights they had in retrospect as they reflect on the session. And then they'll often come up with some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I did find that as at the end of the session, when you're out of the hypnosis, some people, you can see the look on their face, they're not ready to talk about it, and then others, all they want to do is talk about it, and just to find that way to judge what is the best thing to do there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's useful. Yeah, that makes sense. I see that a lot, and I think that's, as a therapist, that's a decision we need to make. For the people that are not ready, or that's perfectly fine. And for the people that want to talk about it a lot, in fact, I'd even encourage them to do some journaling and some writing. So they can sit there and tell it to you, but I think they're better off really just sitting and really writing. So once again, it comes down to being a writer and reflecting and getting the most out of it. So I think that applies when we're learning past life therapy, and it applies, and we can teach that to our clients as well. I think that really benefits them too. So for you, like overall, so you've gone on this journey. You started off with an interest in all these kind of things as a young person, and studied hypnotherapy, and finally got into past life regression as a therapist. Is that something that what is going through that long journey and then becoming a therapist? Because it's one thing to be interested in past lives, deeply, but it is another thing to commit to being a professional and to working with other people and to learning through your own direct experiences. Our clients have their own direct experiences, not just seeing a movie, but by really feeling it and having the emotions coming up. But then you're part of that as well. So what's it meant to you in your life, sharing these experiences, creating them, giving them to other people? What's being a therapist meant for you?
I suppose it's really a feeling that you're privileged in some way, and you're lucky that you're kind of a facilitator. It's not like you're a doctor and the healing is all down to you, and the patient, they just have to do as they're told, and then they'll get healed. It's a partnership with the person that you're working with, and so it feels like, yeah, you're lucky to be a facilitator, to help people get into that space where they can get those insights and get that therapy. And it's a partnership. No one's going to go into hypnosis if they don't want to. They need to follow your guidance. You can't force it on them. And there's that idea that all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. They follow your guidance, and I don't know how to describe it. In some ways, you're a bystander. You're just helping them, but you are guiding as well. You go through the whole session. You're asking the questions. You're deciding when to do this and when to do that. But yeah, that's how it feels to me. That it's you're lucky to be able to help people go through this stuff.
Yeah, I know. I feel the same way. It is. There are certain sessions where you think, how is it possible that humans can have this kind of experience? I mean, it's amazing. There's a magic in it, and like for the clients, as you mentioned, there are some clients who said there's no way they get it this kind of healing result through any other kind of way. And I think as a therapist, it's quite a unique therapy to do, and it has quite unique benefits to the therapist, and it can be very satisfying in many ways for that. So, is there anything that you would say to people who are interested in, doing all the work and committing and being obsessed and going through all the discomfort and nervousness, and is it valuable and all those things? So there are a lot of barriers to being a therapist, and but there are a lot of rewards for it in the end as well. So, what would you say to people who are interested in, taking it to a professional level? Any
I'd say
advice
it's
that
very
you'd give them?
rewarding. Yeah, it's very rewarding, and you get a lot out of it, and you get to meet a lot of interesting people, and it also gives you insight into the community around you. You might be like me and do it all with Zoom, and I'm in the UK, and most of my clients are in the USA. But what you learn is that there's a lot of people out there who have things happening to them or with them, maybe physically or mentally, that can be quite upsetting, and they are not living some happy life that it appears they are from the outside. And so it gives you some empathy, and it changes the way you treat people around you, whether it's your family or your work colleagues, or maybe just other people you meet. You realize that lots of people have these little things that may be causing suffering. And I think that changes the way you treat people, and you have more empathy and less judgment. And like years ago, 20, 30 years ago, you might see someone who's very overweight and you think, oh, why don't they just stop eating all that food? But actually you find that there's background to that. The reason they eat is not just because they're hungry or they're just greedy. It's down to all sorts of environmental issues, and maybe in their upbringing or in their background, that causes them to eat. Because look, having a lot of weight is a mental thing, not a physical thing in a way. So I feel that that's what it's given me. It's given me a viewpoint on people in general, that they're very complicated, and there are things going on that we're never aware of, because everyone hides this stuff away when they're at work or just meeting as friends.
So, for people that are interested in working with you, how can they contact you?
Well, my website is called pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. And that's a kind of dual website where part of it's dedicated to the podcast and part of it's dedicated to the Past Life Regression Therapy. And you can contact me there through the contact form, but it's also a link to a booking page. So you can go on there and choose the date and time that suits you to do a free consultation. It can be 20 minutes, and we can just talk for 20 minutes and see if the past life regression therapy is what you really want to do. And it might be that you really do want to do it, but you decide that I'm not the right therapist for you and that you need to find someone else, or you might do it with me and think, well, this guy's great, which is what I always hope for.
Yeah. That's great. So if you're looking for sessions, Simon is a great therapist. I'd really recommend contacting him and benefiting from the kind of therapeutic work that he can do. And so, Simon, what about your own past lives? Have you recalled them, and how do they connect to this life, or what did you experience in the past?
My first past life regression, College of Psychic Studies, went back to a life as a small girl, first of all, in a park in London. And for some reason, I knew it was 1895. And later on, a few years later, I went to a part of London I'd never been before. And I found that park exactly as I saw it in the past life regression. But that went on to have a life as a nurse in the First World War. And it was interesting that I could kind of, during the regression, I could kind of feel the clothes. And it was later on that I Googled, First World British nurses' uniforms from the First World War. And that was exactly as I'd seen it in the regression, which, maybe I'd seen it in a TV show or something. But I remember having this scene in the past life regression where it seemed to be 2:00 in the morning, and I was in this huge long tent that had all these beds in it and all these soldiers with these horrific injuries, but it was really quiet. It was like the still of the night. And then one of the soldiers had a problem and me running up to try and help him. And I had this annoyance. It was like, oh my God, why do I have to wear all these skirts? And it was like this big sort of long to your ankles skirts that was part of the uniform. And so being a bloke, you wouldn't have that kind of annoyance. You wouldn't be aware of what that could be like. And it felt like it was a long held annoyance. Like for years, I've been thinking, why do I have to dress like this when I'm supposed to be in this job where I've got to be running around and helping these people in emergencies? And so there's that kind of emotional thing that came up. And then later in that life, I was married to this man who was quite abusive. And he had this attitude of, oh, you're just some useless, stupid woman. And I had such anger during the session, thinking, you don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. And all this stuff I did in the First World War when I was helping these dying soldiers and their legs blown off and all sorts of things. So that session really set me up for being so fascinated in it because of the emotions that came up and the physical feelings and the visualizations, the things I was seeing that were later verified through traveling to that part of London or Googling imagery, And so that after that, the other past lives that came up, I had far more interest in some way. There was that feeling that, well, okay, if this one is real, and in some little way I might have verified it, then these other ones also might be genuine. And so that made the interest in it more powerful, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a great story. I think there are a lot of benefits there. So if you're wanting to become a past life regression therapist, I think it's really useful, if you haven't already, to have some past life regression yourself. And it's one of the benefits as well with the Past Life Awakening Institute doing the session swaps. You get to practice with somebody else, but on the other side, you'll get to receive sessions from somebody. Therefore, you can go through your own past lives, and that really helps build your own rapport of knowing what it's like on the inside. So you might be thinking, oh, what's my client thinking? But if you have a few sessions of being the client, knowing it from the inside is really helpful. And it can then motivate you to do all the necessary work and training because you've experienced it. So I find that helps giving that compelling motivation to be one of the few that get to the end and graduate and get to practice and get all the benefits from it. So thanks so much for sharing those stories about from the inside and the way that you're now able to do that with other people. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's been really interesting. Thanks for asking me to be a guest.
My pleasure. So I really recommend you check out Simon's website, his podcast, and his therapy work. Thanks for listening or watching. To find out more about my guest, see the links in the description for details. If you're interested in having personal sessions or certification training in hypnosis or hypnotherapy, or regression to this life, past lives, between lives, or spirit releasement therapy, then visit my website, the Past Life Awakening Institute.com, for details. Thanks so much for watching or listening, and see you next time.